Abban a kiváltságban volt részem, hogy interjút készíthettem egy elismert akadémikussal, egy olyan emberrel, akinek küldetése van, aki szembenéz sötét történelmünkkel, hogy jobban megértsük az eugenikus gondolkodás mindig is jelenlévő súlyos kérdését. Marius Turda a 20. század közép- és kelet-európai biomedicina nemzetközileg elismert professzora az Oxford Brookes Egyetemen, az Orvosi Humán Tudományok Központjának igazgatója. Igazán objektív szemléletet vet egy nehéz és meglehetősen ellentmondásos témára, amely gyakran politizálódik, különösen a válság idején, mint azt Turda professzor is mondja. Az eugenika eszméjét pedig gyakran túlságosan leegyszerűsítjük. Nos, ez minden csak nem egyszerű, ahogyan ezt tőle hallani fogjuk mindjárt. Joggal mutat rá, hogy tükörbe kell néznünk, kritikusnak kell lennünk önmagunkkal szemben, és meg kell néznünk, honnan származnak az eszméink, illetve hogyan és milyen céllal alakították nyugati kultúránkat és mindennapi nyelvhasználatunkat bizonyos ideológiák, legalább a gyarmati idők óta. Turda professzor számos könyv és tudományos cikk szerzője ebben a témában. Megtalálható a confront-eugenics.org címen és a Twitteren @Marius Turdaként. Nézzétek meg az Eugenika podcastjét, a publikációit, olvassátok el a könyveit, amelyek mindegyiken megtalálható az alábbi leírásban található linkeken keresztül, és kérlek nagyon, osszátok meg ezt a videót messzire és széles körben, hogy mások is képezhessék magukat ebben a fontos témában. Köszönöm, hogy megnézitek, és jó szórakozást a beszélgetéshez.
It's fantastic to have you here, Professor. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you and to share some of my ideas and views about eugenics.
Right, let's get right into it. Let's get deep into it. The idea of creating perfect people within a perfect society is nothing new, really. We've had this idea since at least Plato, but when it comes to the term eugenics, which is a term we use since Francis Galton, I believe, most people would associate that term with Nazi ideology, but it's way more than that. So my question is, how did eugenics influence and transform Europe and the West?
You're rightly pointing out that there is a long history of eugenics, at least a type of eugenic thinking that can be traced back to the classical philosophers. And certainly we have that in Plato, in the Republic, what he envisions his utopian world guided by eugenic principles, in other words, the control of reproduction of certain people and the social division and the cultural division within that society. Also, we are familiar with what can be called infanticide eugenic practices. They were popular amongst the ancients, particularly we know the case of Sparta. But we also have examples of other societies across the world which basically would abandon babies or children with physical, disabilities, shall we say, or really get rid of the older people. So yes, there is a certain history behind the thinking that certain people are more valued than others. But as you rightly also pointed out, it is with the emergence of Darwinism and positivism in the 19th century and overall of secularization and modernization that eugenics emerges in the way we recognize it today. And it was indeed Francis Galton, the English polymath, who coined the term in 1883. He experimented with various options before that. For example, he used the term stirpiculture or stirpiculture. Stirpe is the Italian word for race, kin, family, tribe, but it sounded slightly awkward in English. And of course, at the beginning, eugenics sounded as awkward, I suppose, as you can imagine, but now it's much easier to pronounce it. So Galton actually was the one who, being obsessed with how heredity works, being really interested in the preservation of certain cultural and social privileges associated with his class. He became very much focused on trying to formulate what he called the science of eugenics in the 1880s. And as I said, it was very much helped by the fact that by then we have a proper theory of evolution produced by Charles Darwin, his half-cousin. And also we have a very big debate within emerging sociologies about the role of society and how society is to be looked at. You have people like Herbert Spencer, Auguste Comte, and finally there is a cultural, more broader debate in the West, which is about modernity and what modernity does to us. In other words, people were very critical of how quickly we modernized, how quickly urbanized, industrialized, and we lost a great deal of what defenders of tradition would claim was the soul and the spirit of the society or of the nation. And so there's the generalized feeling that by the end of the 19th century, we're going down the drain. If something doesn't happen, something doesn't intervene, and people are not taking action immediately, we are witnessing a widespread degeneration caused by everything from alcoholism to criminality. People with disabilities are becoming more and more numerous. And of course, this is connected with a feeling, which we could hear today as well, that the white people or the white race are losing their preeminence and their dominance, and we're basically in decline. So the big replacement theory, we created, the Western culture, we're slightly going out of history now. We're going to be replaced by these non-white people who are inferior to us. So that's the context within which eugenics emerges, and then really captivates a great deal of people. You have politicians, you have activists, you have feminists, you have anarchists, you have conservative radicals, you have racists. They're really trying to pick and match, as it were, mix and match, as we say today, what was convenient to their particular ideology and particular interest in a social problem. And by 1900, or by the time Galton's passed away in 1911, you have eugenic societies in Germany, in Britain, in Sweden, in the United States. You have eugenic journals. The Eugenics Review was launched in 1909 in London. The Journal for Social and Racial Biology, the first one in the world, was established in Germany in 1905. By 1913-14, you have already eugenic societies in Central Europe. So there you have a very solid and quite complicated conversation about eugenics, very theoretical. Some of it is very scientific. It's connected to the debate on Mendelism, biometrics, anthropology. Some of it is quite popular and popularized. You have eugenic congresses in 1912 in London. So a big and complex history before the Nazis come to power in 1933. In other words, there is an important part of the history of eugenics we need to know, which is very global, very European in many ways, and American, before 1930s. Then, of course, the Nazis come in, as you know, and they really capitalize on it. So eugenics becomes a national policy, sterilization law, the T4 program, and then the Holocaust. And then afterwards, we have these interpretations which obviously quite rightly are highlighting this extreme form of eugenics, Nazi eugenics. The problem was, of course, that after a while, the conversation only gravitated around Nazi Germany, whilst developments and very important legacies of eugenics in other countries were not only marginalized nor looked at, but completely ignored. So, in the 1990s, when I started looking at the history of eugenics, I did not know anything about other parts of the world, apart from Germany, of course, a bit about Britain, the classical history of the 19th century, and something about the United States, even the Scandinavian countries, which as you probably know, had sterilization laws until the 1970s. There were no research in the early 1990s. Only in 1996, 1997, we have a proper book about eugenics in the Scandinavian context. And then, of course, that kind of thing sort of cascaded into a lot of conversation in the Scandinavian context, in Sweden in particular, but also Norway, Finland, Iceland, and then in connection to social democracy and non-totalitarian regimes which favored eugenics. And then was a renewed interest in British eugenics in that context, because obviously it was slightly considered to be appropriate to compare Britain to Sweden or to Scandinavian countries. And then by the sort of early 2000s, the entire conversation goes in so many directions, including East Central Europe, which was previously completely ignored. So even if you look at this historiographically, you realize that a global focus is important because it truly shaped the modern world. And whilst it is legitimate to look at it through the prism of Nazism, eugenics did not disappear with the defeat of Adolf Hitler. Eugenics continued after the Holocaust and continued in ways which are, interestingly, more problematic in many ways than what is traditionally looked at in the 1930s and 40s. And now we're trying to get our head around it and try to understand how come that it survived, considering the horrors of the Holocaust and how many millions of people were discriminated against, was institutionalized, was sterilized, were abused physically and mentally in the name of eugenics. So how was it possible that this continued until very recently? On the other hand, is very interesting to ask the question, how come that epistemologically we didn't put the same effort at understanding this as much as we did with racism or anti-Semitism or ethnic nationalism, ideologies with which, of course, eugenics works very well. So we are now at a sort of critical moment, favored, of course, by what's happening in the world. We had the pandemic, which really brought forward a lot of debate about who is worth living and how is worth to live. Then the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which really reactualized or brought forward again the importance of ethnic nationalism, reimagining of history, the importance of cultural memory, the whole thing about Nazism. So we are in a moment where this conversation is happening, and it is important not to forget to bring in the history of eugenics. If it was only for historiographic reasons or for the reasons related to historical memory, would still be important to have it, let alone, as I tried to very sketchily point out, it's actually something that influences us to this day. We are continually living in a eugenic mindset when we see someone with disability, when we talk about laws regarding bioethics or medical ethics, when we talk about cloning, when we talk about assisted reproduction, we look at the debate in Canada now about MAID, medical assistance in suicide, in medical assistance in death. Sorry. So this continues to impact so many of our lives. It echoes so widely within our social realities that to not be aware of it and not to engage with it critically and historically is very problematic in my opinion.
Taking sides really easily and jumping to conclusions without actually knowing how deep the roots go, as you often say. And even in Scotland, I mean, it's not just Canada, it's Scotland today. So to me, it's absolutely insane what is when I see it. And what is also insane, at least for myself, that I never heard of eugenics being so widespread and global until I found out about it in your books. And since we are on your books, you have a wonderful and huge book about Eastern European and Hungarian eugenics. Can you please tell us?
That's the one about Central European eugenics, which I can show if you want to popularize that. And that's the one about Hungarian eugenics, which
that's
of course
the one, yes,
benefited for a very thick Romanian translation recently. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest in the neighboring country of Romania, of course, about Hungarian eugenics.
And it's available online. If someone wants to buy it, they can purchase it, and it's a fantastic read. I mean, it's not easy, so it's full of information. It's a historical book, but we've got so much knowledge within that. I call it, not religiously, but just to express its depth. It's the Bible of eugenics, in my view. Again, not on a religious note.
History of eugenics rather than eugenics. So just to clarify, I don't want people to think that actually we are promoting eugenics. It could be.
Oh yes, of course. Sorry.
History of.
Yes, absolutely. No. No, it's a history of eugenics, of course. Yes, so thank you for clarifying that, if someone misunderstands me. So there was a moment in Hungary in the early 19th century when eugenics really got on foot, and pretty much the entire intellectual community picked it up, lifted it up. And my question to you is, what was different about it, if any, compared to Western ideas or eugenics evolving in Western Europe and in America?
Yeah, Hungary is a very interesting case for a number of reasons. At the end of the 19th century, it emerges within, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire or monarchy, within the Habsburg Empire, Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It emerging as a very forward-looking country. It's very keen to modernize quickly. Budapest is the city looks today, basically. It really expands. Buda and Pest become one in the 80s, 70s, 80s. There is a major program of modernizing the city, from new buildings to improving living conditions, and to transforming Budapest in the capital of an empire. The Hungarian state, looked at, understood as a kind of multi-ethnic state, but within that, of course, the Magyars or the Hungarians constituting the political and cultural and scientific elites. And as they were picking up various traditions of how to transform their state and their country, and finally, in a way, believing they are on the way to making Hungary Hungarian after centuries of not having that state belonging to them, they picked up not only on traditions related to urbanism or tradition related to economic development. They also picked up, very interestingly, on scientific traditions. They were popular at the time in Europe and the world. And so there's a very strong debate about what kind of economic development, what kind of economic theories work for Hungary. It's European, but not quite as advanced as it is industrialized, but not as industrialized as England or Germany. So you have this debate then as now, where do we belong between East and West? And which better works for us? So they start discussing these major debates about what is the future for us. Within that debate, people on the left and on the right, feminists and Jewish intellectuals, start adopting what was the dominant narrative at the time, which was about eugenics and eugenic narrative of national and individual improvement. So what was very surprising to me, I didn't know anything about it until sort of the 1993, 1994, when Maria Kovács, a very important Hungarian professor at the University of Central European University in Budapest, published a book on Hungarian physicians and lawyers and their sort of interest in anti-Semitism in the interwar period. And she mentions some of the eugenic work these people are interested in. And I was very surprised, because obviously I grew up in a tradition that we didn't speak about Eastern European eugenics. We didn't speak about European racism. I didn't know anything about Hungary apart from, although I studied 19th century and I did my BA and my MA on Hungarian topics. These were not taught, or you could not find anything in the books. So then I wanted to understand why was the case, and whether it was marginal, insignificant, or it was something else there. So I spent about 20 years researching Hungarian eugenics, and all the way to the 1950s. So the book that you mentioned is the first one. The second one is coming out now, which is about race and national character in Hungary. So it continues the conversation into a period. So then I realized not only that Hungarian eugenicists were actually very well read, and which is not surprising, because obviously all of them were like prominent physicians, prominent scientists. They were absolutely fluent in German and French, some of them even in English. They studied in Germany and in France. Obviously, anyone who studied in Germany in the early 1900s would have come across all these debates about race and eugenics, which was so popular in Germany. So that was the other thing, that always crossed my mind. So we're so keen to highlight, all the Hungarians are in no way different in terms of their scientific creativity. They were so up to date to debates across Europe. But then obviously all of the debates about race and eugenics, they completely, close their eyes and cover their ears. And didn't make any sense, right? So either you accept that they were indeed completely attuned to everything that was going on in the world at the time, in Europe and in America, or you simply say, well, they were selectively and consciously separating this from everything that now we consider to be problematic or bad or really difficult for us to accept. And I realize this is a very unhealthy historiographic argument. And I started digging and digging, and then what I arrived at was phenomenal. So this was before, of course, that the whole debate about eugenics turned very racist. So you have people on the left talking about eugenics in relation to, how can we modernize Hungarian society? We need to improve the quality of living. We need to improve the quality of the population. We need less drunkards. We need healthy families. I mean, a lot of the conversation, which continues to this day, what is to be Hungarian? How can we protect our Hungarian families in comparison to, say, the time, of course, were the Germans, the Roma and the Romanians in various areas, and the Slovaks? How can we promote the Hungarian element? And this is not simply a nationalist rhetoric, but it's at the same time, how can we help the Hungarians thrive economically, socially, and culturally? It's not enough to have 5 Hungarians in the village if they can't buy land and all of them are alcoholics. Eugenicists will come and say, so there was nothing at first glance about race or racism here. It was simply about thinking, well, we need to actually improve the quality of the population in this way. So a lot of the people on the left would actually start talking about this, what happens with the workers in the cities. So in cities like Budapest or Kolozsvár, Cluj, a lot of the leftist eugenicists in the early 1900s, particularly after Huszódik Sászló, the famous journalist established by Jászai Oskar and his friends, they have a very strong group of intellectuals who actually try to modernize and help people in cities and in the villages. Of course, at the same time, you have a nationalist conservative rhetoric, both Catholic and Protestant, that talks about the Hungarian race in a way that we can call it today racist, very nationalistic. And for them, eugenics obviously was about promoting the racial qualities. So they should not intermarry with Romanians. They should not intermarry with the Roma. They should keep their purity in a way untouched. It's something that Dezső Szabó would develop later on in the 1920s in his famous novel, The Village Swept Away. Basically, we need to separate the Germans from the Hungarians, and the Germans, or for him, the German minority in Hungary, were for example, the racial enemy. So you have all these ideas circulating, and That's internally speaking. So obviously, if you're not familiar with the very complex debates about national identity in Hungary at the end of the 19th century, and very few people in the West are, because obviously if you can't speak the language or read the original text, you wouldn't know how complicated this was. You know, the divide between rural and urban, which in the populist movement at the time, you know, those populist writers, the Népiek, they were called. All of these sort of things are completely difficult to explain to someone who is not familiar with the region. Within that, imagine that complex story, complex narrative is like a texture so dense with so many threads. Imagine within that comes eugenics and kind of, you know, tries to put it all together. And this is, we're talking about a period which is before 1914, so there's still a great deal of optimism and enthusiasm, which we could see, of course, in 1896 with the celebration, the Millennium celebration, when Hungary believes they are finally amongst the top European nations in the world, European nations and the top nations in the world. So there is a certain nationalist fervor. There is a great optimism that Hungary is, you know, becoming that country. So that's the period where all of these ideas circulate, and you have psychiatrists, you have physicians, you have social workers, you have politicians discussing this. They start to go to conferences, important people like Teleki Pál, Prime Minister twice, Hofmann-Géza from Transylvania, born in Oradea, Opati István, another famous Transylvanian scientist. He was the director of the Institute of Anatomy in Kolozsvár, Cluj. So we're talking about people who finally become organized. And with the Academy of Sciences, they create a first committee on eugenics in 1914. All of these traditions come together. You still have the left and the right working together. So it's interesting because once the war erupts, you would have people on the left like Magyar, József, very prominent communists, working together with Hoffmann, who was obviously a conservative radical and the one who actually is the most famous Hungarian eugenicist in many ways, because he was well connected he was consul in America. He was well connected to the American eugenicist. He published the first book in German on American eugenics in the world. Then he moved to Germany and he became a member of the German eugenic movement. He was very close to prominent German eugenicists. He died very young. He died in 1921. He was deplored by German eugenicists like Fritz Lenz, for example, as one of the founding fathers of the German eugenic movement. So he was really, really important. And he returns to Hungary in 1917. Teleki is asking him to reorganize the entire eugenic movement in Hungary in connection to what the war is offering, both in terms of possibilities and more importantly, I suppose, in terms of the challenges. So Hoffmann works with Teleki at his trying to see what will happen after the war. I mean, this is still the moment where they don't know about Trianon, right? So they don't know what will happen. Even if they lose the war, they could not really conceptualize. I mean, no one in Hungary in as late probably as 1918 would have seriously think that Hungary could collapse as a state. I think even when they accepted it's going to be defeated, and Tisza István, of course, declares this in parliament and is assassinated. You know, when we lost the war, they realize this is really bad for us. Eugenicists within this political culture are trying. They are trying to find a way to what they called, you know, we need to protect as many Hungarians as we can. So they're very concerned, for example, with working with the invalids and people, you know, who return from the war, because from a racial point of view or eugenic point of view, even if you lost a leg, you could still be a good father. But then, of course, they realize we need to introduce eugenic schemes like, OK, we will give you land, for example. So we're not going to give land to someone who's a Serb or a Romanian, although, of course, at the time they were still part of Hungary, part of the Hungarian army. We're going to prefer only Hungarian, was they called, you know, Foly Magyar, Hungarian defined by not just language, but for at least 3 generations, family Hungarian, to help that. So they started already talking about these things. And then the war finishes, and of course, what happens? You have this period, but some of these ideas, particularly the radical racist ones, are in a way abandoned during the communist experiment. A lot of the social and in a way medical aspects of eugenics, which were already very present in Hungary before 1918, are experimented with during the communist republic, particularly the whole discussion about people with mental disabilities and what do we do, where do we put them in the hospitals, and but of course it's short-lived. And then comes, of course, the peace conference at Trianon, and sort of the whole thing is reconfigured. So when I looked at this, and I realized that there is so much we can learn from that, from the Hungarian case study. Not only that, important scientists are not known today, right? I mean, apart from a very small group of historians of medicine who actually looks at all these scientists who were so important at the time, because at the time, of course, being a professor at university meant not just sort of teaching your specialism, but also you had a very active public and cultural life. All of these people were president of societies, of organization for various cultural activities. You know, in Transylvania, where these people activated, there were major associations promoting Hungarian culture, from newspapers to journals to, hiking. They will go, into the mountains and, build a healthy body, and talk about, what we need for the young people, religious activities. Obviously, that was a type of intellectual that existed at the time. And this is very interesting because a lot of them, whilst did approach eugenics through their specialism, so if they were biologists or psychiatrists or physicians in general, they could understand actually a lot of this conversation about eugenics, excuse me, from the point of view of their area of expertise. But even more interestingly to me is then when they go outside their area of expertise and try to implement that or disseminate that to the general public, because this is how it works. Yeah. So that's one aspect. The other one, of course, I wanted to make sure that people who are not familiar with the Hungarian case study can and would learn about famous, as it were, Hungarian eugenicists, because they were very important at the time and they deserve recognition in the way other authors deserve recognition, and they are talked about in the scholarship. And thirdly, and perhaps problematically, is clearly how much of these ideas survived not only the interwar period. To me, that's a big chunk, of course, because we have the Holocaust and sort of Hungarian racism in the interwar period, and anti-Semitism, and of course the whole thing in the between 1940 and 1945, and then the communist period. And then, of course, today, that's the interesting bit, how many of these conversations about who is Hungarian, what is Hungarian, what is the Hungarian family, the pro-natalist, eugenic rhetoric of the 1920s. We are not, we're not mixing with other races. We are slightly different. We know all of this sort of rhetoric and examples that are being given by recent politicians for the past 10 years. I found it very disturbing in the way that allows me to affirm or to say it out loud that this is possible to some extent, not because it is disingenuous. So it's not just populist talk here. It is possible because there is a genuine interest and concern within the Hungarian community, both in Hungary and abroad, that we're disappearing. We know enough. And this is kind of a scare that exists in the 19th century, exists in the 1920s. And then what do we do about it? And all of these eugenic ideas were part and parcel of that conversation about Hungarian identity. And in order to understand them better, we need to actually do it. We need to go back in time. We need to unpack trajectories of thought. We need to explain where this conversation comes from. And some of it, yes, some of it has got a very clear eugenic heritage, and that has to be called out. So it is relevant in this way too that we are learning a bit more about Hungary, because as politically speaking at the moment and diplomatically speaking, Hungary is quite in the center of attention, not only due to the war in Ukraine, but also due to the fact that every now and then there will be an outburst rather disturbing, racist or nationalist, ethnic nationalist, which happens, particularly when some of the leaders of travel to Transylvania, where seems to be the place where they really, really enjoy saying quite nasty things about about what Hungary is supposed to be doing. So yes, there are so many levels of urgency here that we need to look at, and it might be difficult because obviously, as I pointed out, it's a very complex history, and Hungary has a very complex history, and people don't take the time to probably read everything and to understand it properly. They, like you say, that you easily jump to conclusions, and that's not good either. So it's not easy to simply call a politician racist without actually understanding the long history of Hungarian debate about, say, what is national identity, national character, family, or the role played by religion. It's very easy to call him racist, although it's certainly what he says or she says may sound racist to us, but actually within the context of the debate in that particular country, all makes sense. He or she knows exactly that these words echo and are understood by the audience, because the audience already digested, internalized a century or more of eugenics and debate about how can we protect ourselves. And this is not just about, geography, because as we know, as Széchenyi said, Hungary is not, Hungary will be. So it's not just about whether we love the territory, it's also that we are immortal as long as the nation lives. It doesn't matter where we are or what the Hungarians are, the nation is eternal.
And I can confirm, and thank you so much for the extensive answer. It's terrific to hear you talk about this. You are absolutely right. I can confirm that still this kind of worry for the nation, worry for heritage, worry for lineage, and also worry for running out of time, it still exists in Hungary, running out of time to multiply in a eugenics kind of terminology, Well, anyway, we're shortly running out of time, and I want to ask you: have we got time for one more short question? Because I'm really curious what you think about the future, and not just future of Hungary, future of eugenics. We see things like, and you earlier alluded to that in a way. You mentioned some examples of current eugenics thinking or it existing in current societies. So, for example, transhumanism, people like Nick Bostrom, people like Ray Kurzweil, or even going back to the environmentalist movement, or Julian Huxley, who wrote the founding paper for UNESCO, people like that, whose grandfather was actually, Darwin's bulldog, a famous eugenicist. So does it exist today? And you said yes, but what do you predict? In one of your recent talks in Warsaw, which was the first International Humanities Society Identity Congress in Warsaw, you said that time and again, identity is politicized. This sometimes resulted in horrendous outcomes, particularly in moments of social and political crisis. And here we are. I think we're heading towards a big crisis, and we're already in it. So what do you predict?
Well, it's hard to predict certain things because the situation is so much in flux. You mentioned some of the authors, and that's one big conversation we're having in connection to transhumanism, human enhancement, genetic technologies, cloning, and all in all, sort of, in what way can we talk about a new eugenics, which is, as some of these people like Széchenyi Bostrom will put it, is non-interventionist, is not totalitarian, is not state-directed, but it's personal. So if I decide that I want to, and I can afford it, of course, because it's all about money ultimately. If I decide that I want to choose the color of my baby's eyes, why shouldn't I? If I want to screen for genetic disabilities. Why shouldn't I? If I want to eradicate down because my someone in the family had it. So you have this big conversation about which is, I think, very problematic, ethically speaking, from my point of view, because I think these people are simply playing with human emotions, and they're simply cynical in many ways. Because first of all, we know how little consent there is when it comes to, the doctor or the geneticist will just advise, but you make the own decision. We know that this is not really the case. Very few people actually are non-influenced by all of these. And we've seen this with radical examples of people, women in particular, who continue to be sterilized until very recently. We saw that in Australia. We saw this in North Carolina, sorry. We saw that in Alberta in Canada. So this has happened a few years ago. So of course, there is a discussion where the physician or the nurse will tell you, these are the benefits and the side effects. But if I'm in labor or in a state of subconscious, am I able to give you informed consent? Or if I speak to a geneticist or physician who's very, is very hard on using jargon language or terms I don't understand, how much informed consent is there? I completely don't get it anyway, and so on and so forth. So I'm trivializing a bit to drive the point home, that namely, when people talk about the individual decisions, I think we have to be careful. How much is that actually? So that's one segment. The other one is what I called, and this is something that I'm interested in more recently. I'm trying to understand how the dehumanizing language of eugenics continues to influence us, and you could see this happening in moments of crisis. So we continue to, in Europe, if you look, the kind of eugenic dehumanization of the Roma continues uninterrupted. They're still undesired, they're still asocials, they're still parasites, inferior. All of that language dehumanizes them to the point that actually it becomes possible and it is permissive to treat them differently. Their intelligence is not the same level as ours. They could be in a special group or in the class. We do special programs for them in the way that basically we did with the reservations. We put them in special schools. Everything that is very obviously, it's eugenically informed. It's very biased, and it's simply in the name of we're doing something for them. Basically, it doesn't give them a sense of humanity, the one that is shared by the majority. At the same time, as I could see this with COVID and the debate about disability, which is very prominent at the moment, is that the language that was created by the eugenicists continues to inform our perception of these people. All of the words we use normally when we talk about people with disabilities, particularly people with learning difficulties or learning disabilities, like, idiot or moron or, feeble-minded, or all of these are eugenic words. They were created by people to catalog, separate, and then institutionalize and penalize and treat people who, once they were categorized or cataloged in these ways or labeled in this way, once the eugenic stigma is attached to them, then it becomes possible to do that, because obviously they're not like you. You are a moron. Your intelligence is, over 6-year-old. So then obviously I'm going to treat you like a 6-year-old. So once this becomes accepted, no matter whether this is false or not, and in most cases it was false, obviously, it was based on the physician or the psychologist or the psychiatrist simply attaching the label to you. So understanding this language and how important language is to shape reality and shape perception, it's relevant to seeing where the conversation is going in the future. Because I don't think, whilst we can fight various developments in genetics, and we can say, well, whatever we do from cloning to human enhancement, we have to take the ethical aspect into account. We have to make sure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and people should understand the history of eugenics in order to learn from it. That's one level. However, at the level of the population, which is the important thing, I suppose, in many ways, people are completely unreserved in using, or unscrupulous and uncritical in using eugenic ways of reflecting a reality. And then we have to intervene here. if you have to have a debate with the geneticist now, the geneticist will tell you straightforwardly, well, no, I'm not a eugenicist. So it's the same with these guys promoting human enhancement. They'll say, well, we're no eugenicists, because these are guys, they were racist, and they immediately find a way to get out of the question and simply say, well, you don't understand us. Well, we're proposing something entirely different. And then you say, okay, well, let's explain this a bit. But then there's the conversation. Whilst, of course, it's very different when we look at what's happening at the moment in the crisis we're going through globally, nationally, and individually, some of us. Very difficult to leave. The economic crisis is getting deeper. The recession, the war, now the absolutely horrific earthquake in Turkey and Syria. You realize that actually we are, this is not bringing in the whole debate about overpopulation, ecology, environmentalism, which again has a very long eugenic tradition from the 1950s onwards. You realize that actually we do need to be more forthcoming, more aggressive even, to really question the fundamental premises of this, and then actually push forward to a way to overcome it and come together and think of a future that's still livable for all of us, not just for some of us.
Thank you very much. And one more thing, you're working really hard to spread the word. You're educating people all over the world. You're giving lectures. I will leave links to your social media and your books. When can we expect the next book to come out?
Yeah, at the moment I'm traveling with this exhibition on the legacies of eugenics, which you can find out more about if you look at my public engagement project, which is called Confront Eugenics. So I'll be going to Sweden and then America. So in connection to the exhibition, which is about the global legacies of eugenics, I give talks and I try to, engage in conversations about what eugenics is, the legacies, and the importance for our reckoning today. At the same time, as I've mentioned already, I'm finishing now this book on Hungarian eugenics and national character and race, which will be submitted this year. And there will be a book on Romanian racism, which will come in also this year. So I haven't quite forgotten about the Eastern European chapter of this global saga, or this global narrative, or this global movie. But it's very important to me to always go back there and engage with the conversation there, because that is much needed. And this is why I'm also very grateful to your invitation, because obviously you're doing exactly the same thing. This is something that bridges a global conversation with a national conversation in Hungary. And this is extremely important. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And please keep up the good work and take care of yourself. I hope to speak to you in the future. Thank you.